There are 32 players over the last 20 years that hit 8 or more sacks as rookies. Will James Pearce and Jalon Walker be the 33rd and 34th names on that list?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And guys, if you do not know me, I am your humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka the Jolly Green Giant, aka Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 20 years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this podcast, where I've been podcasting here on Locked On Falcons for almost 9 years, and in previous incarnations of a podcast for the previous 5 years. So we're pushing 15 here on the podcast, and I appreciate each and every one of you that go strong with me, whether you've been here for almost 15 years, or you've only been here for the last 15 seconds. Appreciate you for going strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we're talking about the Falcons losing out on Jaire Alexander, why that happened as he heads to Baltimore. And we'll talk about just how intentional are the Falcons going to be when it comes to giving James Pearce and Jalon Walker some snaps this year. But, we'll get into that conversation because I saw a tweet floating around, I think it was Tuesday, about, James Pearce tearing it up at minicamp and having the potential to have 15 plus sacks. And it brought me back to a place I was a decade ago with the Vic Beasley hype when he was drafted, and it was like, oh, is Vic Beasley going to get 15 plus? Very similar. It's why, when I say I've covered this team for a long time, it's just like all of this is the same thing. It's like, it's all cyclical, right? But, I did some research back then in 2015 at falcfans.com, RIP, in the lead up to that 2015 draft about, the potential likelihood of the Falcons landing a pass rusher that would have an immediate impact in the league. Because even then, in 2015, we knew that the Atlanta Falcons were taking an edge rusher at the top of that draft, just like in 2025, we knew that the Atlanta Falcons were taking an edge rusher at the top of the 2025 draft. And, we didn't know that they were going to take two, but, we could have seen it coming. But, back then I looked back in 2015 at some research to look at all these various rookie pass rushers that had 8 or more sacks, because at that time that was a rare sort of benchmark for players from 2005 to 2014, the decade leading up to 2015. And I've updated that information having done the research over the last decade. But there were 16 players back in 2015 that in the previous decade had hit 8 or more sacks over that span. And I noticed a trend when looking at those players where the vast majority of them joined either a team that already had an established guy that had 8 or more sacks the previous year, or they were joining a team that had already established itself as a defense in the top half of the NFL, right? Where they were top 16 at that time in points scored. We weren't quite on our DVOA rankings. I've updated since looking at the DVOA rankings, but top 16 in scoring defense as an indication of joining a good defense. And while I wasn't quite making the connection at that time, now that I look back at it with a decade's worth of experience and understanding, to me, this is getting at to the root of the conversation you've heard me bring up a ton, particularly when we talk about James Pearce and Jalon Walker, in addition to Michael Penix or really any rookies, which is that nature versus nurture debate, which is how much of an NFL player's success is nature, their inherent ability, and how much of it is nurture, the environment they go into. And this research was kind of signaling that, at least with pass rushers, there was a significant amount of nurture and environment that influenced their success. Because basically what the data was showing was that, it's easier for these, rookie pass rushers to produce right away when they're either going to a place where they don't have to be the guy, right? Where they're joining a team that already has an established 8-sack guy, which is basically the idea that they come into the building being expected to be Robin as opposed to Batman, right? Or they're going to an already good defense. It's essentially they're being asked to be a cog in an already well-oiled machine, and you can just kind of drop them into that and they can be successful. And so when I went back and updated the information looking at the last decade, 2015 through 2024, interestingly enough, 16, the exact same number of players hit 8 or more sacks in that same span of time. In the previous decade, 10 of those 16 we would qualify as the Robins that joined a team that already had an established pass rusher. In the past decade, 11 out of those 16 were Robins, right? So very similar number, right? And where things changed was the joining of a good defense. Right. In that previous decade from 2005 to 2014, 11 of those 16 players joined a good defense that measured by points allowed that were top 16 in points allowed. Updating it for DVOA rankings, it would be 10 out of 16 in that previous decade. In this past decade, it was only 4 out of 16 that joined above average scoring defenses, and only 3 out of 16 joined defenses that were in the top half of the league the previous year in DVOA. And so, that latter trend in terms of that not being an issue could be for a variety of reasons. I have no idea. I can only guess. Maybe it's because it's easier for guys to stand out nowadays on bad defenses, in part due to it being a passing league and guys getting more opportunities to impact as pass rushers. Who knows at this point in time? But, where does that mean? What does all that information mean for James Pearce and Jalon Walker and their potential to have this type of successful season in year one? So clearly the Falcons do not have a Batman based off of last year's team, right? That they're joining here in Atlanta. However, they are joining a player that the Falcons did bring in, guy who technically would qualify as their Batman based off of this exercise as a guy that had 8 or more sacks, and that would be Leonard Floyd, who had 8.5 sacks with the 49ers last year. And to me, what's interesting when you look back at the last decade, there was one notable example of a team that I think has parallels with what the Falcons are hoping to get from both James Pearce and Jalon Walker. That's the 2022 Detroit Lions that drafted Aiden Hutchinson in the first round and then got a little-known guy by the name of James Houston in round 6. And both of those guys had 8 or more sacks as rookies. Hutch had 9.5. Houston had 8 in that rookie season. They were joining a Lions team that was 29th in DVOA. Oh, guess what? What was the Falcons ranking last year on defense in DVOA? 29th, right? And they were joining a team that didn't have an established Batman. They had someone who was close in the previous year in 2021, that Lions team. That was Falcons legend Charles Harris, who had 7.5 sacks in 2021. Hutch and Houston joined that team. They get, multiple sacks. Harris kind of goes by the wayside. But it was, barely missing the cutoff of this 8-sack benchmark for a Charles Harris. So it's a kind of, if you squint, it's kind of a situation. And so you can imagine either Leonard Floyd or maybe Arnold Ebiketie, if you believe that Arnold Ebiketie is going to make strides, could be sort of that Charles Harris, who's not a true Batman in the way that we're talking about it here, but maybe that's good enough for Pearce and Walker to kind of be like Hutch and Houston were, and both of those guys coming in and being 8+ sack guys as rookies. So that to me, I think is not out of the realm of possibility, because we've seen an example of it when it comes to the whole, James Pearce could get 15 sacks, or even Jalon Walker could get 15+ sacks this year. That's a little ridiculous to me, because basically since sacks have become an official stats since 1982, no rookie has ever gotten 15 sacks in his rookie season. The closest being Javon Kearse in 1999, 14.5. And I know Jerry Gray made that comparison, given that he was on that Titans coaching staff. And I think that's where that's stemming from. It's like, could James Pearce, or in this case, James Pearce or Jalon Walker, if you want to throw him in, could be the next Javon Kearse? Sure, it's in the realm of possibilities, but I wouldn't necessarily go into this summer expecting that type of production. We won't get into all the reasons why, but I do remember in that 1999 preseason, the Falcons played the Titans. I have very vague memories of watching a preseason game where Javon Kearse played the Falcons in the preseason and absolutely annihilated the Falcons in that game. I think they later played the Falcons that season, and I think Kearse broke the record for most sacks in a rookie season against the Falcons, if I'm not mistaken, as well. But basically, I bring that up just because I will retract this statement in terms of Walker and Pearce being Kearse-like if we get to the preseason, in that game against, the Lions or Titans. Interesting enough, Lions, we're talking about Hutchinson and Titans serendipity. So we'll see. We'll see. Maybe the stars are aligning there. But if we get to one of those preseason games, because I don't think these guys are going to play against the Cowboys, but if they go into those first two preseason games and absolutely annihilate them in the ways that my memory, again, I don't remember exactly what the stats were, and it's a memory that's over 25 years old at this point. But if they annihilate whoever the Titans and Lions trot out there in the preseason game, and my recollection, again, this may not be accurate, but my recollection is Pearce had like 3 sacks in that preseason game, in like 2 drives or something like that, and had like 2 forced fumbles. It was like a ridiculous game. That's what I remember, but that might not be accurate. If they do that, then I'll be like, okay, maybe the Javon Curse comparisons are a little bit more apt, but we'll just have to wait and see. We'll get there at some point in August to see if they can garner that type of production where maybe these guys can get at that. But I think the challenge for both of these guys are they going to get enough snaps in order to put up that type of historic production that we're hoping for from these guys? Because I feel like we're going to have the same conversation that we've had so many times over the last decade or more, which is, why aren't these rookies playing as much as we want them to? And we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So this time of year, when you're trying to, corral these kids and go on vacation or head to the beach or whatever you're trying to do to have your hot boy or hot girl summer, you always want to make sure you got enough money in the bank. And sometimes you check your bank account and you're like, I don't have as much money as I thought I did, whether that's from dining out, online shopping, or other forms of entertainment. It's easy to lose track, and Monarch Money is going to help you become your personal CFO and give you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just any old budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center where you can track all your accounts, investments, and spending all in one place, and even plan your long-term or short-term summer goals, and stop managing your money and start building wealth, right? So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year. So in the process of doing this research, and it's going to be something that I haven't finalized yet. We'll definitely get there when we get to the beginning of the season, because every year for like the last couple of years, that Wednesday before the season starts, I always do like a season preview where I do stat projections for the Falcons and my official win-loss projection. So that will be coming in September. But it takes a couple of, I'm not gonna say it does, but like you start doing some research early on so that you can at least sort of set your expectations. So I don't have to do all that research, the first week of September or whatever, you start it now. So, one of the things that I've been looking at is how the Jets kind of divvied up their snaps along their defensive line over the last 3 years. That Jeff Ulbrich was the defensive coordinator there. And obviously now with Jeff Ulbrich being the defensive coordinator here in Atlanta, and the expectation that we will see some similarities in terms of this attacking front using that 4-man wide 9 front this upcoming season. And the Jets were consistently a team that had like a 10-man rotation. And I expect the Falcons, when we look at their roster as it sits here today, are projected to have a 10-man rotation. That will be sort of the core of their, defensive front. And the Jets consistently over those 3 years had like 6 edges and 4 D tackles. Sometimes it was 5 and 5, but you can kind of glom on that 6 edge and 4 D tackles on the Falcons 10-man group, with those 6 edges being Jalen Walker, James Pearce, Leonard Floyd, Arnold Ebiketie, Zach Harrison, and Braylon Trice. And then the 4 defensive tackles are David Onyemata, Morgan Fox, Ruka Roro, and Brandon Dorlus, right? We'll see what happens with guys like Kentavious Street and LaCale London and Taquan Graham, and can't forget the incomparable Khalid Kareem in terms of how they push for jobs in training camp. And, I know there are some people that are like, I'm not convinced that Trice and Dorlus are going to be significant parts of their rotation, given what we didn't see from those guys last year. So we'll see. That will be a part of the conversation. But at least 8 out of those 10 guys, I think we can be fairly confident are kind of etched in stone in terms of their roles in the rotation. But a big part of, I think, this training camp is going to be, what's the hierarchy, right? Who's going to be at the top of that 8-man group? Who's going to be at the bottom of that 8-man group? And that's going to determine who's getting snaps come the regular season. I think the big thing is going to be that ultimately guys are going to have to earn it, and that includes Walker and Pearce. But one of the things you notice looking at the Jets is that there was kind of an anchor player for them. That was Quinnen Williams. He was the guy that over the last 3 years has consistently gotten the most snaps, right? He led the team, the defensive front, in snaps in both 22 and 23, and he was second on the team in 24. And had he not missed a game due to injury late in the season, he almost certainly would have led the team in snaps, averaging about 45 snaps across all 3 of those years per game. There is no Quinnen Williams on this team. If Grady Jarrett was still on this roster, he would probably be that player, as Quinnen Williams and Grady Jarrett have seen a similar amount of work. I don't expect the Falcons to try to use veteran D tackles like David Onyemata or Morgan Fox that way. I don't expect that from Rukaroro this early in his career. Now, maybe if Rook had gotten more run last year, we could maybe feel more confident of him making that leap. But he played roughly 150 snaps last year to jump to about 750 snaps that we're talking about with Quinnen Williams. I think would be, expecting a little bit too much from Rukaroro in year 2. I expect him, maybe a more realistic projection would be somewhere in that 400, 500 range, maybe a little north of that in terms of total snaps this upcoming season. And I ultimately kind of think with the top 3 guys on the D tackle rotation between Onyemata, Fox, and Rook, they're going to be kind of largely interchangeable. So it will be, none of those guys will probably reach 750 snaps. But, Quinnen being the anchor point for the Jets, right? Like, it was kind of the idea of like Quinnen's going to be on the field the vast majority of the time, not every snap, only 45 out of 60 some odd snaps, but like he's going to be the guy that's consistently on the field. And then the other 3 guys in that 4-man front is just kind of rotate. Like, they're going to rotate another D tackle alongside him. They're going to have a bunch of different edge combinations and whatnot. And I'm curious when it comes to Pearce and Walker, where they're going to be in the hierarchy. Because right now I'm projecting, and we'll see how this plays out, but I'm projecting Ebiketie and Floyd to kind of be, if anybody's going to be an anchor point, if anybody's going to approach 750 snaps this year, I would bet on Arnold Ebiketie or Leonard Floyd being that guy, right? If Grady was still here, he played 744 snaps last year, he would be the guy that we'd be saying that about. And maybe that's a reason why Grady chose Chicago, because they're not going to put that type of workload on him, given potential depth that they have up front. But ultimately, I think regardless of whether we're talking about Ebiketie, Floyd, Pearce, Walker, etc., Rook, it's going to be earned, as I said earlier, right? And that's what we're going to pay attention to in training camp and going into the season, and because that may not be something that's truly resolved by the time we get to the end of August. And obviously, we want Pearce and Walker to kind of be those anchor point players, those go-to guys, the guys that are on the field. But I'm not going into the summer, and maybe this changes over the course of training camp, but currently not planning to go into the season expecting those guys to come out of the gates and be those guys, right? That, looking it up over at profootballreference.com, since 2012, which is how far their snap count data goes back, there's only been 20 rookie defensive linemen over the last 13 seasons that have hit 750 snaps as rookies, right? That's only about 1.5 per year. So I would not bet on Pearce or Walker being those guys. If I was going to bet on any of the rookie D linemen in this year's draft class to hit that snap count, I would probably bet on Mason Graham with the Browns or Michael Williams with the 49ers, just given the lack of other talent on those defensive lines, and the fact that they're also going to potentially play every snap on rundowns and whatnot. And that to me is going to be the biggest obstacle preventing Pearce and Walker from getting a ton of snaps, because they're a little underwhelming against the run. Now, maybe they show in camp that, those concerns are not as big an issue as we think. When I say we, I mean me and my massive ego, think watching their college film, but we'll just sort of have to see. And so, I look at guys like Jermaine Johnson and Will McDonald, 2 first-round picks, edge rushers for the Jets that they've had over the last 3 years. They didn't come out of the gates. They saw massive jumps in playing time in years 2, but coming out of the gates, they weren't playing a ton of snaps. Like Jermaine Johnson averaged 22 snaps a game as a rookie. McDonald averaged only 12 snaps a game, right? Johnson rushed the quarterback 151 times as a rookie. Will McDonald only hit 99 pass rush snaps. And I think Walker and Pearce will get more opportunities than that, but right now, as we're sitting here, and then we'll see if this changes by the time we get to September and I do my official projections, but I'm kind of projecting both Pearce and Walker, to be somewhere in that 200, 250 pass rush snaps range. That's about how many opportunities I'm expecting them to get. And that's probably going to be somewhere north of 300, maybe 400 snaps total for both either one of those guys. And so that makes me believe that we'll spend a lot of time, or y'all will spend a lot of time, because I don't know if I'm going to be spending that much time talking, a lot of discourse around the Falcons defense this year, at least early on. If that is the case, and these guys are only getting, 20, 25 snaps a game, is going to be like, we got to play Pearce and Walker more, and we need more juice up front, and that's going to solve our defensive problems. And the question, of course, to me is going to be, is Arnold Ebiketie and Leonard Floyd, at least in that early going when that conversation is going on, are they going to be productive enough to sort of quiet those complaints, or are they not going to be productive enough, and therefore that's going to open the door for people to be like, yeah, we got to get Pearce and Walker on the field, because the guys that are getting more snaps ahead of them, maybe Zach Harrison's in that list, aren't getting the pass rush production that we're hoping to see from that group. So that will be, I think, a big topic of discussion, 3+ months from now. But it's always fascinating to me. Every year, it seems like, the discourse around the Falcons defense is always about, this young player isn't getting enough snaps, and we need, if we just play this guy more, will magically fix the defense. Last year, that was obviously people being disappointed with the lack of opportunities for Ruka Ororo and Brandon Dorlus. There wasn't really a guy for that in 2023, I think, in large part due to the fact that that defense was actually pretty decent. And so people didn't have an opportunity to really be like, oh, this one rookie is going to solve our problems. But I do recall once Clark Phillips did get on the field and replace, Jeff Okudah, around week 13, people were foaming at the mouth, being like, this is the future. In 22, that was Arnold Ebiketie was the guy that people were complaining about not getting enough. And there was a sprinkling of D'Angelo Malone in there. I wonder where the D'Angelo Malone truthers are now that he's moving the off-ball linebacker. In 21, it was a lot of Richie Grant and a lot of Ade Ogundeji. We got to get these guys on the field. Why are we playing Eric Harris and Stephen Means? In 2020, it was, I recall it being a decent push for Michael Walker and even Jalen Hawkins getting more opportunities. In 19, I think that was John Kaminsky that was the guy. In 18, that was Isaiah Oliver. How are we playing Robert Alford when Isaiah Oliver's here? And, as I go through that list, I'm sure many of you guys note that a lot of those guys didn't turn out to be anything more than like just backups and role players as their NFL careers wore on. And it feels like no one else seems to notice this trend, which is part of the reason why I tend to be a little more dismissive of when people are trying to say, oh, if we play this rookie, it's going to solve so many problems. And again, if it's not clear, like, I'm not anti playing rookies or playing young players. I'm very much pro playing rookies and young players because they need the reps. I'm just anti thinking it's going to magically fix your defense because you put a rookie on the field. And, I've just heard so many fans and media say that for the last decade, and it just never seems to work out that way. And it's just always fascinating. I call these people the snap count scouts, right? The people that, base their opinions off of how many snaps a guy is getting, not actually watching the film of these guys playing football. Because I think when you watch the film, you're like, okay, like, yeah, maybe getting this rookie 5 more snaps would be beneficial to him, but like, it's probably not moving the needle for your defense in a major way. But it all goes back to 2014, right? Where, I just remember so vividly all the debates, the endless arguments, and the Jonathan Massaquoi versus Corey Bierman. And it was like, this is why Mike Smith is going to get fired, because he refuses to play young guys like Jonathan Massaquoi. And when Dan Quinn got hired, people were so pumped after that season, almost as pumped as they are for Michael Penix, right? And it's like, Dan Quinn gets it. He's going to play these young guys. You'll see. And then, like, the first roster move that Dan Quinn made was cutting Jonathan Massaquoi, and I laughed so hard. And I still got a bottle of the salty tears of all the Falcon fans that cried when Jonathan Massaquoi got cut. And there's still a couple drops in the container. I'm hoping to kind of refill that bottle that's in the back of my freezer as we get through the Pearce Walker discourse, as we see those guys not getting enough snaps, and all those tears and the crying. It's just going to be wonderful. I just can't wait. I can't wait. It's just, just waiting for it all season long. So, speaking of Falcon fan tears, let's talk about, how salty people are. That maybe some people are salty out there that the Falcons didn't land Jaire Alexander. We'll explain why they didn't land him as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So in case you missed it, Jaire Alexander, the former Green Bay Packers cornerback, signed a 1-year deal worth up to, I think, $6 million with the Baltimore Ravens on Wednesday. And I know this is disappointing to a lot of Falcon fans, and I know there are many that were pining for the Falcons to sign Jaire Alexander. And if you were one of those Falcon fans, well, I would like to welcome you to the Locked On Falcons podcast, because you probably missed it last week when we were discussing the possibility of the Falcons signing Jaire Alexander, when we kind of told you that it probably wasn't going to happen. So, and that was on the episode with myself and I believe Trayshawn Diaz. I think that was last Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken, or last Thursday's episode, I guess. It was whatever the first day of the mandatory minicamp. So I guess I recorded it on Wednesday, and so it aired on Thursday. But we spent a lot of that time sort of debating whether or not the Falcons should pursue Jaire Alexander, and so probably the message got lost a little bit, because Trey was like, his lack of availability due to injuries made Trey skeptical of whether that would be a good move, and I was more in favor of signing him, but you had to mitigate those injury concerns within the contract by getting him on cheap deal. And I talked about like maybe $8 million. Obviously, the Ravens were able to get him on even a cheaper deal than that. But basically, what was lost in maybe that conversation as we were discussing it was basically the notion that it was like, yeah, both he and I were of the mindset that it was unlikely, regardless of what the Falcons may want or what we may want, that they were going to land Jaire Alexander, because he would probably have better options that would be willing to potentially pay more. Obviously, I saw some reports that suggested that, he turned down more money from other teams to sign with the Ravens, because basically, he could go to a winning team, or a team that can win more than the Atlanta, or at least a team that has proven that they've won more than the Atlanta Falcons, at least, September through December. Yes, call me Kobe Bryant. I'm throwing shade at Lamar Jackson. No, but and one of the things was like, that's the thing about being a free agent, is you get to choose, right? So I think anybody who's mad at the Falcons for not landing Jaire Alexander, it's like, for all we know, the Falcons were the team that offered, reportedly rumored to offer him more money, and he turned them down. And it goes back to that conversation we were having with Trey about other things in regards to Jesse Bates, where it's like there are consequences to losing, or in the Falcons' case, consequences to not winning. And success attracts players like Jaire Alexander. So, basically for me, what I said on that episode talking about Jaire Alexander, where like, to me, the only realistic way that the Falcons were going to land Jaire Alexander is that they were willing to outbid everybody, which would have defeated the purpose of trying to get him on a bargain, which was the main justification for trying to land him. So I hope that makes it a little clearer for those of you that, again, if you do have some tears that you want to offer up, I am collecting them. But yeah, I think that's going to do it for us here. In doing the research, going back to the earlier conversation, doing the research about these rookie impact pass rushers, there are a couple of guys that were outliers that, weren't necessarily joining Batmans or weren't joining already established defenses. There were basically 4 out of the 32. I'm not counting Hutchinson and James Huster in this list, basically because they barely missed the cutoff. But the other guys that were 4 outliers in this 32 sample over the last 20 years were Ndamukong Suh, Yannick Ngakoue, Max Crosby, and Micah Parsons. So you should think about those guys as kind of special in terms of not only what they were able to achieve early in their NFL careers, and some of them as their NFL careers went on, but when we think about outliers, like, those guys qualify. Von Miller would also qualify as one of those outliers, although technically he was joining a Broncos defense that had Elvis Dumervil, but Elvis Dumervil missed the previous year. And so that's why there was technically not a Batman on that Broncos defense when he joined it, Von Miller, in 2010, because Dumervil missed that season. But the previous year, I think he might have led the NFL in sacks the previous year or something like that. So, and then you look at the Rams. The Rams were the teams that have done it the most. They've done it actually with 3 players over the last 2 drafts, right? Kobe Turner and Byron Young in 2023 both had or more sacks as rookies. Braden Fisk had 8.5 sacks last year. You also had Jared Verse, who didn't have the sacks to qualify, only 4.5 sacks last year, but obviously had a ton of pressures, a historic year of pressure. And funnily enough, it's not Aaron Donald who was the Batman in either one of those instances, because in 2022 he was hurt and only had 5 sacks that year, and Leonard Floyd was the technically the Batman with 9 sacks that year, if I'm not mistaken. And then last year, when Braden Fisk joined the team, the leading sack artist was Kobe Turner, who had 9 sacks to Aaron Donald's 8 sacks the previous year. So just interesting, I'm not suggesting Aaron Donald had nothing to do with it. Like we all know that Aaron Donald was the Batman, but just looking at this exercise in terms of the statistics, it was other players that were the Batman, the Robert Pattinson. So just some interesting things. So I'll be curious to see if Walker and Pearce join this list, because the list of 32 players includes a lot of like Hall of Fame players, right? DeMarcus Ware, Clay Matthews, Von Miller, Aaron Donald, both Bosa brothers, Max Crosby, Micah Parsons, potentially Aiden Hutchinson, guys that are, whether they, we'll see what they, only like none of these guys are technically, other than DeMarcus Ware, but all these guys are on the path, let's say, to head to Canton. And so if Pearce and Walker somehow find a way to join this list and wind up, getting on the field early this season, producing, and thus we're not talking about these guys only getting 300, 400 snaps this year, and instead we're talking about these guys getting, 750 plus snaps, that does give them the best chance to join that list of players. And if they do join that list of players, then it is very promising for the future. So we will see how it all plays out. It's going to be a fun summer to watch these two young pass rushers and see what they grow into. As I often am, I set my expectations low, and then I allow the Falcons, every once in a while, they will actually exceed my expectations. And I'm hoping that Pearce and Walker are two of those guys that do wind up exceeding my expectations. But at least in the build up to training camp, I'm not going to necessarily be like, oh yeah, these guys are definitely getting 8+ sacks or 15+ sacks or whatever. It's like, they'll probably get like 4 or 5 sacks, is right now where I'm expecting them to be. But the door is wide open for them to do more than that. And my heart is open, ladies and gentlemen, for those guys to exceed those expectations. But that's kind of where I'm at right now, where it's like, yeah, they'll probably get like 3 to 4, maybe 5 sacks. That's pretty typical for a first round rookie edge rusher, especially when you take out the Micah Parsons of the world that get 13 sacks as rookies. And it's like, yeah, they're kind of skewing the data quite a bit when it comes to the rest of the groups. But we'll see. Maybe we found our own Micah Parsons. Like, I'm not going to complain about it. I'm just saying, like, I'm not there yet. Again, I'm just waiting for that Lions game, watching James Pearce terrorize Penei Sewell. Oh boy, it's going to be pretty. It's going to be pretty, but we'll see. So that's going to do it for us here, guys. We'll see what's cracking tomorrow, I guess. Jarvis Davis, maybe. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. So that's in store for you tomorrow. Something we'll probably be talking to Jarvis, and we'll see. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, for your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast. Joe Marino, Kyle Krabs are going to make you the most informed fans all summer long, get you geared up for training camp, break down all these rosters and teams that are poised for Super Bowl contention, including the Atlanta Falcons. So it's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.